In this podcast, Bill Franks, Chief Analytics Officer for the International Institute for Analytics, talks about the ingredient of a successful analytics ecosystem. So, stay tuned. So, welcome everyone to another episode of Future Data Podcast. Today we have with us an amazing guest. We have Bill Franks. If you are in data or analytics, it's very difficult that you don't know Bill. If you don't know Bill, I think you should. So, a brief background. So, Bill is a Chief Analytics Officer for the International Institute for Analytics, where he provides perspective on trends in analytics and big data space, helps clients understand how IIA can support their effort to improve analytic performance. He also serves on the advisory board of multiple university and professional analytics programs. He has held a range of executive positions in the analytics space in the past, including several years as Chief Analytics Officer at Teradata. Bill is the author of the book, Taming the Big Data Tidal Wave. In the book, he applied his 2 decades of experience working with clients on large-scale analytics initiatives to outline what it takes to succeed in today's world of big data analytics. The book made Tom Peters' list of 2014 must-read books and also the top 10 most influential translated technology books list from CSDN in China. His focus has always been on to help translate complex analytics into terms that business users can understand and to then help an organization implement the results effectively within their processes. His work has spanned clients in a variety of industries for companies ranging in size from Fortune 100 companies to small non-profit organizations. He earned a bachelor's degree in applied science from Virginia Tech and master's in applied statistics from NCSU. With that, Bill, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Beautiful. So I think we know each other for quite some time from Teradata days. It was always fascinating to see your work and how much sort of you work out to help others understand this convoluted world of data analytics. So to help our viewers and listeners understand, if you can walk us through your journey and what brought you to this level and your background, that would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I guess the interesting thing coming from the time that I started working, I'd actually say that I was as much lucky as anything. And I always mention that because when I came out of grad school with a statistics degree, there were pretty limited opportunities in the business world. In fact, I recall, I'm going to say about half of the graduates from my program would go on to be professors. Probably close to 30% would go into the pharmaceutical industry doing the old, clinical trial work. Another, the bulk of the rest went into government, whether it be Census Bureau, Fisheries, Wildlife, and there was only a handful of us that actually went into business. So when I first started, there was no career path. There was no such thing as senior analytics people. There were hardly any analytics people. And so I did it just expecting potentially to have sort of a behind the scenes technical career. That's what was available. Of course, it's evolved so much, and I've been lucky enough then to be at the perfect spot as this has arisen to have, the experience and ability then to help, lead some of the early teams that have made all of this transformation happen over the last 10 to 15 years.
Interesting. And what brought you to and tell us about your journey as in analytics and working. So how has been your journey in the analytics domain as such? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, so I started out at AT&T back right after they were broken up. So a lot of people may or may not know, if you're younger, AT&T used to be a monopoly, and it was the phone company, the only one. So I was building literally the very first churn models ever done when AT&T, the product lines I was assessing was still over 80% market share. Because they had just been broken into the baby bells, and now they've all been, rolled up in various ways. I spent some time then doing marketing mix models, pricing, and assortment optimization in the retail packaged goods industry. A number of years, as most people of my generation did, through direct marketing agencies. Back when I initially got into that, it was largely still direct mail. Then it moved on to email, and of course, since has blossomed into all of the e-marketing activities as well, and digital. And then, as you mentioned, I spent time then at Teradata, largely because what I had found when I was the guy building all the models and trying to implement these things in the early 2000s was the frustration of the lack of scalability and the common nature where we'd find some amazing results mathematically, statistically, that we knew would have a big impact on the business, and we couldn't actually deploy it. So, people talk today about some of the difficulties deploying and the barriers from a political perspective or organizational, et cetera. Back then, there were true technical barriers. It was very, very difficult to actually deploy these. So I went to Teradata to try and explore that intersection of how do you do scale and analytics together, and had a good run there. And in my final years there, I wrote those couple of books, the newest one being the Analytics Revolution. Started doing a lot of blogging, a lot of public speaking, decided I really enjoyed that aspect, probably substantially more than having the big team and worrying about all the HR phone calls, late at night, or legal contract issues, et cetera. And so I came to International Institute for Analytics about a year ago now to focus more on those parts I like, which is going out, talking to customers about what's happening in analytics, what they might be doing. I do my monthly blog, writing research briefs for IA. So it's been fun.
Interesting. And tell us about, like, from your vantage point, what is the state of analytics that you're seeing now? Like, how has it evolved from your vantage point? If you can walk us through that.
Yeah, so the good news, there's always room for improvement, but I don't think there's ever been a better time to be in analytics. So you go back even a decade, there were still some fairly large companies that would question whether they needed to invest in analytics, whether they even needed an analytics team at all. And maybe they'd have a few pockets here and there, but there was no strategy, no meaningful, purposeful investment. It just, the marketing people said, to meet my goals, I need this team of 5 people cranking out these models for me, and no one stopped them. That's far different from a mandate that you will use analytics. You must build that team, and it has to be a core part of your strategy. So today, at least the majority of the large clients I work with fully get that analytics is important. They are actively investing. There's many cases where they're still probably too fragmented and not necessarily focused as well as they could be. But, very few companies I'm aware of are shrinking their analytics investment or their teams. Most are growing it, and they're struggling with the growing pains that come from it. So, I guess if you're someone that only been on the job for 5 or 10 years, it'd be easy to grumble about some of the growing pains that are being felt. And those are legitimate gripes, right? When you live it day to day, it's painful. But from my perspective, it's amazing to be able to be arguing about exactly how fast we expand and what the priorities are that we hit first, as opposed to the old debate of why are you even here and why do you have a job, let alone you want to hire someone else, which was except for a few cutting edge companies, pretty much the state of it, back even in the 90s.
Interesting. And if you can also walk us through what is International Institute of Analytics, like what do you guys do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were founded by Tom Davenport, who wrote, most people might be familiar with the book, Competing on Analytics. The 10th anniversary just came out, in fact, in the past 6-7 months. We are a research and advisory organization. We do not sell any hardware or software. We also don't do any tactical implementation services. We won't build you models. We won't implement a platform. So we focus purely on providing research. We do events. We provide access to our global expert network to ask questions, and so forth. And to the extent we do consulting, it's really at the strategy level. So the design, planning, and strategy of an analytics program at the program level. Again, not, how do you do this project? How do you do that project? So that's the space that we play in.
Interesting. And what has been your observation from IAA's lens, how the industry is maturing in their analytics practices? Like, what are some of the things that you could share that you are seeing that how the industry is maturing?
I think one of the interesting things is there's still a lot of debate, and probably one of the most common questions we get asked about is how to structure the analytics organization overall. I think the key is that the the nature of the question, perspective from which it's being asked, is actually pretty drastically different than a short time ago. I think it's because the natural progression tends to be you start with a fully decentralized team, right? So traditionally, marketing was often the first group in a lot of companies to have analytics. And then, somebody from supply chain noticed marketing was doing good things. They hire a few people. Finance maybe hires a few people to be deeper into forecasting. And you end up with a bunch of teams. So even a few years ago, the conversation was generally around, we've got all these teams all spread out, and what do we do with them? There was then a period of time where there was almost a reaction too far the other way. A lot of companies started to combine all their teams into a centralized organization. And I think that went a little bit too far. There's cases where that has worked and can work. But the problem is you end up then not being as tightly aligned to the business units. There's funding issues, for example, if you're set up as an internal consulting where people have to pay you as they use you, of course, then they try not to use you, especially when budgets are tight. If you're free, then they'll overwhelm you with requests because the requests are free. And so what's happening now is most organizations are settling into what we would call a hybrid, one of several variations where there's probably some central organization where maybe a CAO sits and a couple of key execs helping to define the strategy and guide it. And then there's people dispersed out within operations, within supply chain, within marketing, that are embedded with those groups, but still have a relationship and accountability to the centralized organization. So a lot of times when the question is asked today, there are still those further back, but a lot of the questions are more of, we've already got the central team and we've got some of these embedded units. How do we make them operate a little more effectively? And how do we tweak the charter to maximize the impact, which is a far different set of questions than, how do I consolidate everybody, or how do I come to a mix in the first place?
Interesting. And I think I was talking to one of the sort of executive from Boston ecosystem who was building a company around data ops. So and we were talking about how great analytics come from good data, and good data come from fair enough IT. And when you talk about sort of in today's ecosystem of say shadow group and shadow sort of use cases, and companies are building around it, the IT is getting very fragmented. And sort of when the IT is getting fragmented, their data sort of creating a central data archive or creating central data sort of lens is again getting messed up in that perspective. And then obviously the analytics comes after that. That brings the insight. So what has been your observation? Like, are you seeing from your vantage point the similar struggle between businesses getting value vis-a-vis IT? Like when even your IT is not organized the way it should be to run for the future, how can you generate like insights that actually impact the future? Like, what has been your observation?
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, I think, there's the age-old struggle with IT and analytics teams. And again, if you go back historically, when I first started, everything was on the mainframe. And so you were inherently stuck going through IT. I mean, IT owned the mainframe. There was no other option. There was no such thing as desktop analytical tool sets. Then, when we went to more of the client server based methodologies, and, for example, there were years when I owned my various companies' SaaS environments, we would effectively create our own data environment outside of the official IT systems. And that was the standard for many years, where it was, to your point, shadow IT, whatever you may call it, where we had full flexibility within our environment, but then we hit up against those barriers of scalability and so forth. What started to happen over the especially the last 6-7 years, as big data hit, and it becomes impossible for a dedicated analytics system off on the side to necessarily handle all the data, let alone effectively in an integrated fashion. It's kind of forced the marriage back, where IT and analytics have tried to work together. There's been a ton of work on the platforms, everything from the classic engines like a Teradata or a DB2 that have embedded analytics within it, to the new engines like Hadoop and Spark, where the work to enable analytics to occur right next to the data. It's been extensive, and so today it is possible to have a system that has the data and that can execute the algorithms that we need all in one place, and that can even be a production system. In reality, while that's possible, in a lot of companies, the various policies and the politics that dictate how those systems are used means that analytics teams still have a pretty difficult times in many cases making use of that technology to its fullest extent, and they end up with somewhere in the middle where the core data is in fact stored centrally. They do a lot of their processing at that central repository, but when it comes time to do the fancy stuff, they're pulling off their maybe ready to be model data sets, which are obviously typically shrunk way down from the raw data inside. So, in a customer example, you could have terabytes or petabytes of customer detail data, but when you want to build a customer level model, you're often building it to the customer level or, customer product level, et cetera. I think there's still a lot of work to do, in terms of making analytics comfortable with turning some more things over to IT, but also making IT comfortable allowing more of these analytics to happen on the systems, because the leaders in the industry meaning analytics industry, when you look at the companies, in the digital native space, like in Amazon, et cetera, they are much more effective and grew up from the beginning having the analytics as an embedded part of the process. So it's more natural to them. It's much more difficult for the older companies to do it. But they've got to make that, try and make that journey, or I don't think it's possible to be maximally effective.
Interesting. I think you raise a very interesting point. So any business that has analytics in its culture, and sort of they're incubating it, is doing relatively or sort of significantly better than their peers. Now, if and we know there are not many businesses who are actually having analytics as an integrated practice within their culture. So if you are told to sort of run an organization where this hypothetical is real, in which sort of the culture is not data driven, it's very gut based organization, sort of doing its ways, and now you have been given this task of contain this into create a centralized analytics practice. How would you do it? Like, what are some of the things that you could suggest or sort of you could share?
I think the biggest thing, and so one of the things we do at IAA, we run, we call an analytics leadership consortium. It's a program where we explicitly get chief analytics officers, senior VPs of analytics from a number of companies, and we get them together on a regular basis in a cohort in the same group over time. And we talk about issues, exactly the kind of things you're talking. Hey, I'm struggling with this. How did you guys do that? Bring in guest speakers and so forth. And the point where I'm heading with this is that it is almost in every unit item. And I think this comes down to, if you desire to be a CAO or you're stepping into a senior analytics role, understanding what I'm about to say. And if you're hiring a CAO, understanding what I'm about to say, because it impacts expectations very heavily. It's easy for an analytics person to step into a job with a bit of the, let's say, optimistic view that they're going to step into the role. They now have a charter to run analytics and everything's just going to flow from there. The fact their job exists means that the road's been paved and they just have to drive down it. At the same time, it's easy if you're the non-analytics exec, let's say a COO or a CFO, hiring that first CAO, to assume now that I put this person in place, they'll know what to do. And the reality is, as you pointed out, it's as much a cultural thing as a technological thing. And most of the CAOs and senior analytics leaders I know, in practice, while, in theory, and one day, hopefully they will spend most of their time actually defining analytics processes, actually measuring their success of deployment. In reality, they're still today spending most of their time, selling internally. Here's what we need to do. Here's why we need to do it. Here's what you'll get out of it. Hey, look, this stakeholder agrees that if you paired up in this way, this would work. And it's really an ongoing campaign in the literal sense of the word to get people to buy in. And I think that's that's an easy misconception. Just because, we all have the idealized view of what a CAO does. And I think we all want a CAO to do that one day. Today, you've got to recognize, if you're the person in the role or the person hiring the role, that it's going to take a couple of years, realistically, if you have a company that hasn't, really had this before, for them to work through all of the cultural and process change, buy-in, and so forth. And to underestimate that, that's at your own peril, because that's some huge headwinds that you're up against, and you really have to put the effort and then plan your time frames appropriately, or else you end up committing to something in 6 months and then, you're over by a couple of quarters and you're being viewed as failing. Whereas maybe if you had been able to set the expectation properly, knowing the headwinds you're heading into, people will be able to at least see the progress that you in fact were making.
Interesting. I think you're raising a very, very interesting point. So Even in sort of in our experience, so we either deal with, so when you talk to chief data officer side of things, right? You will hear about their nightmare about data sources and sort of getting IT to give them data, get the data sources that businesses could use. If you talk about chief analytics sources, as you rightly said, their major migraine is in selling very basic component that they think could deliver value of and justify their existence. And both of these guys like pretty much burning down on sort of and getting their normal sort of ecosystem prepped that will sort of help them generate and help them show their next value. How would sort of, what would you suggest to some of the techniques or strategies that either chief analytics officers or chief data officers could pursue to help them sell faster and sort of get through actually delivering value that they've been hired to do?
We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, so I think part of the key is this. And this gets back to when I mentioned earlier how it used to be virtually impossible to truly deploy analytics out in the systems. It was always this offline thing, and that limited its impact. A lot of the low-hanging fruit, the stuff that you can do by following the old processes of I'm going to pass data off, run it overnight, and then pass it back in. All of those, not all, but the problems that fit that model are largely solved, right? And a lot of companies have it. The new use cases where the big value is are those that really get embedded. So, if you're doing supply chain, it's about actually updating forecasts and having those forecasts feed into the system in a way that alters where you're shipping product, how much product you're ordering, changing, truck routes, almost on the fly. And so the challenge there becomes, I can have the analytics proven 100%. I could even show you the evidence for the analytics. The problem then is that in order to make those analytics realize that potential, I'm going and touching the core operational systems that are running the business. And that makes people who own those systems and whose jobs on the line for them working smoothly very nervous. Now, I'm not just talking from the IT side, I mean from the business side. If you own supply chain and you're currently at least succeeding on your metrics, I may tell you that I can increase you by 2 percentage points, and you love that. But you see the risk that as I start to implement this and I inadvertently, as always happens, something goes wrong on a few spots that causes problem, I could drop you a few percentage points in the short term. That's an intimidating and risky thing. And so I think laying that groundwork up front to understand not just what your analytics team will be doing from an analytical perspective and how that would prove out to have lift and benefit from the business side, but simultaneously be working both with the IT team and the business team around, if this stuff works as we hope, what do we actually have to do to implement it? So technically, what does IT have to enable for this to run? And then from the business side, what do you have to change in terms of the processes you're currently following? Maybe the applications and interfaces that your warehouse personnel or your product owners are using to order goods and materials, et cetera. And talk that through up front and be mapping it out, because it takes a while to get the analytics done. And if you wait till the analytics are done to start that second layer discussion, you're in trouble. I'll give you an example. I actually wrote a blog on this about second order analytics. How, you get to the finish line, then you realize you have another entire level to go. So I was talking to a large, they manufacture big stuff like airplanes. And the gentleman was mentioning to me how they had come up with some really good predictive, maintenance algorithms where the assembly line, they were able to identify when certain, either pieces of equipment were having trouble, or they could identify that certain items coming off the line were starting to be a little bit less consistent, so that they had to go in and do a repair. They said they were initially really excited about this because they found some big opportunities. But once they had that, what they then realized, and he wished they had realized this up front, was, so now we know a given piece of equipment is actually needing repair. If you're just driving your car to work every day, that's a pretty easy problem to solve. The first chance you can get to the mechanic, you do it. When you're building hundreds of $1 million items with contractual penalties and, a bunch of people showing up for work or not, he said, even if we knew something was at risk, we then had to go to another layer of analysis of, well, how risky is it? Can it wait until our next planned downtime? Can it wait until this order that we're almost done with, where there's big penalties and it's close to the deadline, is done, and then we can postpone a little bit if we had to the next order because it's smaller and there's no penalties associated. So the point is, the dollar values of the process that they were interrupting for the maintenance were so valuable that they actually had another layer of optimization they had to do that had nothing to do with the initial analytic. I now know this machine is going out. Given the probability it goes out in certain time frames, how risky is it for me to fix it now versus a week from now versus a month from now? And what are the trade-offs in terms of costs that I will be guaranteed to hit if I take it down this week versus what are the potential costs if it actually broke in the middle of the run in 2 weeks because I wanted to wait for 3 weeks? And that's set them behind by, as you can imagine, a good amount of time. That's an entirely separate level of issue to solve. And that, back to my other point then, as you're solving the core analytic problem, you've got to be working through what are the downstream impacts of this on the IT and business side, so you can start to at least lay out the initial plans and frameworks that, of course, will need some testing and may have some hiccups, but you're ready to go. Versus, again, you're done in a year with the analytics, but then you're starting from square zero. You delay yourself a year and a half, two, to get anything actually recognized in terms of value, because you have to go through the pain of all of that integration work when starting from the finish line of the analytics.
Interesting. And from your vantage point and your interaction with other businesses, what are some of the things that you think business don't get it about data analytics, or they get it wrong, or what are some of the thoughts there?
Well, it's interesting. There are a couple things. One is, obviously, just having the data thrown out there does not equal having the analytics done, nor having the analytics able to scale and be implemented. So I think,
good point.
In recent times, so first of all, let me just start by saying the available technologies and architectures today compared to even a decade ago are amazing, right? If I wanted to start up a company today, I could go out and on a pretty small budget, probably in the tens or at most hundreds of thousands, if I was really going big, I could go out on the cloud, set up every kind of data container I need with every kind of analytic tool on top, have a point of sale system set up, capturing data. I mean, it's amazing how affordable it is versus it used to be I'd have to be buying literally huge, massive systems that I'd hardly use initially, but it's kind of like you have a car or you don't. You've got to buy the car to even start being a driver. Now we're able to just go rent the systems, rent the car. So the point is, there's a lot more flexibility today, which I think helps. But one of the mistakes is, just because it's cheap to slap up a container and then throw some data in it, doesn't mean the data has been cleaned properly. Doesn't mean that you can that even if you're accessing it, you can process it at scale, or that it can integrate in with the other systems. So I think one of the mistakes is, again, people have been so hungry for the ability to do something that they go and do things very sloppily and the easiest possible way. And then on the back end of that, they realize, okay, great, I've proven this over here in a way now that I haven't even thought of how the heck I would actually deploy it within my business environment, because it's a completely different environment. So I think there's that accounting up front. The mistake people make is trying to build things in the way they should be built ideally, which is great target state, but not balancing that with what is actually in place today at the organization and what could actually be deployed, right now. If you're going to have to integrate with a mainframe, for example, all the fancy cloud stuff, well, it might help with the processing, but at the end of the day, that data's got to get back in a mainframe. That's not pretty. We all wish it didn't happen, but in large existing enterprises, that happens every day. And that's why I think the digital natives have such an example, or a new startup. You don't have to be a digital native anymore. I think digital native used to imply, pure web-based or e-based organizations. I think today, like if I was starting a retailer today, even if I had a physical presence with these systems available, I could start with data infusing everything I did from the get-go. The companies have been around a while. It's a huge hurdle, much like laying a new highway is pretty easy. And I can tell you in Atlanta, where I live, they're redoing one of the major interchanges between two of the busiest interstates. It's a many-year project involving, I think it's $1 billion or $2 because you have to keep all this heavy traffic flowing while you build the new stuff. If you were to be able to shut down the highways and just build the new interchanges, I bet they could be done in 6 months. And I think that's the same dilemma faced by the large companies. Even as you try and move forward, you can't break the old stuff, and you have to keep the old stuff operating, and eventually you can flip the switch. But it's a lot more difficult than it is if you're just going to say, I've got greenfield, go build this thing.
Interesting. I think one of the interesting point you raised is, so just data probably won't cut it, right? So if you think about, say, as an analytics leader, you're aligned more closely with business, right? So you align with the business story. You have to align sort of how much insights you can deliver to a business story to get to an outcome. But a good analytics is powered by probably some data, right? So if we talk about, say, future, what do you think would be future aligned with? Is it aligned with data or analytics? Like which side would you side if you talk about like future of doing business?
Wow, I think the two are just are intertwined. It's funny. My blog just last week was called, I can't remember the exact term, but is data now more of a differentiator than analytics? And the premise of the article was came to me at our event a month ago in Santa Clara. I actually had the opportunity over a couple of days to have one venture capitalist presented to our public event, and we had a couple other venture capitalists speak to some of our private executive events, and all of them hit on a very similar theme, which is, if you think back, again, let's just go back even to the 2000s, the first decade. Most companies had substantially the same data. So every retailer had their point of sale data, most with a customer number attached. All the banks had the same data. So you start with the same data. The way you differentiate was to do better analytics on that data. And to do those analytics, you had to have specialized skills, specialized tools, et cetera. Well, what's happened in the last several years now, the ubiquitousness of algorithms being available is amazing. I mean, it's not just a few high-end commercial tools that have algorithms. There's open source projects, very robust ones. And then there's little, I'll call them widgets, little rentable widgets that do one thing quickly from an analytical perspective. So algorithms are available cheaply and easily to just about anyone. What this leads to now is that the VC said if a company comes to us and their core differentiator is simply a set of algorithms on a given data set, they're hesitant to invest because the bar or the barrier to entry of another competitor is fairly low, meaning if they got some other smart people, they could probably replicate those analytics. It might take some time and effort, of course, but they're replicatable. Versus what's happening today is companies are differentiating themselves by having unique data that they're collecting that adds value in and of itself. So in the self-driving car industry, for example, there's entire companies set up that are doing nothing but creating self-driving training data where there's a video going down the road and everything's tagged, a stop sign, a crosswalk, et cetera, because that's what's needed. Every car company could theoretically create their own training data. The problem is it's very expensive and painful and boring. So these companies are creating it and then they sell it and they're making, they're profitable. And so once I have a large, robust self-driving car training data set that I've spent millions to collect, and I have relationships with the big manufacturers to buy that data, the barrier for someone to enter and compete against me is incredibly high. I have the relationships, I have the data, I've already paid the money. The analytics on top of it now, the car companies are attempting obviously to outdo each other. And where I ended in the blog was there are absolutely still cases where analytics drive it. And there are now cases though where the data is really the differentiator on a business. The ultimate is to find that place where you can have both. So for example, in the video game industry, I know of a customer who thinks that they're collecting better in-game data than some of their competitors. So they're all collecting in-game data, but it'd be the equivalent to capturing more detail somehow in a transactional record, right, in a classic retail sense. So maybe they're collecting the equivalent of the click screen from a website when the others still have just the aggregate, what did someone buy? And they're analyzing that, they think, more effectively and feeding it back into the game. So they have a differentiator based on we've already collected better data that inherently gives us better info, and then we've built some better analytics using the data. That's the real differentiator. So I think today you have to focus on the data and the analytics in combination. If you're trying to only differentiate on data, again, a niche company, that could be okay. If you want to differentiate only on analytics, you better keep way ahead and have some of the smartest people in the world to continuously top everybody else. The real sweet spot today is how do I continue to add new, novel, valuable data and then pair that with new analytics that are more powerful. I think that's the paradigm shift from, where for a number of years it was an analytics arm race. Now it's an analytics and data arms race.
Interesting. And so if I'm either a professional or an executive at a company, how important do you think it is me to understand analytics, to understand this paradigm shift that you're talking about?
Well, I think it's really important. And this is one of the things I often have people complain to me. So when I'm dealing with a client that's actually on the business side, let's say you're talking to, even let's say a mid-level director of marketing, even sometimes a VP of marketing, who has grown up in the digital age and is used to all of the analytics, et cetera. There's still a lot of super senior executives out there at the CMO, CEO level who didn't grow up in that era at all, right? And who were already in a senior management position before all of this analytics and technology hit. And so while they conceptually see that it's important and so forth, when they were actually in the trenches, they didn't have it. They know how things ran then. And what happens is sometimes that can be a barrier to those people embracing analytics as fully as they need it. What I always tell people when they're frustrated about still struggling to get support from the top is that, again, back years ago, it was hard to get support above the manager level. Hardly anyone says it's hard to get support above the manager level anymore, because anybody at manager and director's probably only been working, either they're young enough, they only grew up in the analytic area, or being at that level for a long period of time, they've had to adapt to it. Now it's the VPs maybe complaining about the C level, but within another 5-10 years, as that top layer does one more turnover, I think you're really, truly going to have people from top to bottom in most companies that not only appreciate analytics, but have worked personally with analytics, if not generating them, using them and making business decisions on them. And I think that's going to make things a whole lot easier. I think that's the last barrier we have. It's just the top layer, maybe two at really huge companies where there's people who can still potentially be resistant to the change that's coming. And so the good news is, again, that'll time out. It's just a matter of, it's hard to be patient, but and you should still push, but the problem will be solved. It's a matter of how fast we can make it happen.
Interesting. And one thing that I was thinking about was that this AI, right? AI is expanding, its capabilities expanding nowadays. How much of analytics in enterprise world do you think would be powered by AI? Do you think really still human created analytical models would be relevant with the advent of AI? Or what would be the role of analytics professional going forward? What would you think?
Yeah. So let me actually address it a little bit different. Let's for the sake of your question, assume AI is yet another set of algorithms that could be applied to any given situation. This is something else I wrote. Tom Davenport and I, for our predictions this year, one of them was called "The Post-Algorithmic Era Has Arrived," and that was one of my blogs, I think, for maybe January this year. And it's not as extreme as it sounds. So let me explain. Does that mean algorithms are over? No, of course not. Algorithms are as important as ever growing, and we're going to continue to embed them everywhere. But back to my earlier point, when I was young in my career, a huge chunk of my value to an organization was the fact that A, I understood the algorithms because no one did. B, I actually had access to the tools that had those algorithms, because back then there was only one or two tool sets that would even let you run an algorithm, and they involved a lot of heavy coding. So back in my day, there were some tools like SAS, Statistica, maybe MATLAB, but they're all heavy, at that point, were hardcore coding environments. So you needed someone who understood the algorithms, who could actually get access to that software and could actually program it. So my value to the business people was being able to get them those algorithms to do something for them. As things have evolved, and back to part of our earlier conversation today, having access to an algorithm is not a differentiator anymore. And they're accessible in environments that do not require heavy coding anymore either. You can pass a data set, have it run a regression decision tree and AI routine, any of those. Not the same as saying someone who doesn't know what they're doing can't screw it up. I'm just saying it's not a differentiator that I can't say I have value because I can call an AI algorithm for you. So what this means now is that we have to look for other ways to add value. Because compounding that is with this ubiquitousness and the processing power, there are multiple tools out there now where you can give it a data set with a certain type of data for a certain class of problem, and that tool set will literally run every conceivable algorithm that's known to man that fits that specific scenario, with dozens or thousands of options if needed within each of those to find the best model. So one of my other value props years back was I could look at a given data set and a given problem from experience, go, for this churn model, I think this type of formulation will work best. And it was critical that I was pretty good at that, because we couldn't afford the processing to do more than a few iterations, and I had to be pretty close. Today, even if I came to you, and even if you had confidence that 99% of the time I would be correct in what I thought would be the winner, it's so cheap and easy to go run all of them. My answer would be, I know you're 99% of the time right, but it's so cheap. Let's go run them all and see if you're right. And I'll give you a gold star if you were right again, but we're going to validate it. So where I think we're heading is an environment where the analytics people have to take it up a layer and be more of an orchestrator and an architect who's making sure the right problems are being addressed and that the right data is coming together to address those problems and looking for the novel ways to apply the data. But when it comes time to do the modeling, to your point, I don't think there will be guys like you and me sitting there actually coding and saying, try this option, try that option, unless you're truly on a very cutting edge, brand new method you're sort of embedding, some new variation on AI. And so that can be a little scary to some people. But I look at it this way. That means I can be orchestrating 4, 5, 10 problems in the same time it would have taken me to do a lot of hardcore coding and experimentation and waiting for things to run on one problem. So I can actually add a lot more value. And I think the trap we have to avoid, and I've written about this before too, is just because you can easily access an algorithm and pass data to it does not mean it's a smart idea for someone who doesn't know what they're doing to do it. So even though, you have a tool that'll find the very best algorithm to predict this factor from these variables, I still want someone who understands the theory and the math and the analytics behind it to make sure we've asked the question properly, that we're predicting the actual correct best variable to predict, that the variables that we'll be attempting to predict it are actually the right ones. Those are the most important decisions before you do the algorithm. And I think historically that's always been probably some of the most critical parts of an analytics person's job. But the modeling itself is what always got the focus or the attention. So I don't even think, as I say this, we're taking away the most important parts of an analytics person's job so much. Certainly not the most interesting parts. I mean, the programming was never the most interested in me. I enjoyed it when I was doing it, but it was really defining the problem, laying out that data set, laying out how you formulate those models. That was the most mentally intensive and the most business impactful. I think that will still be there.
Interesting. And I think one thing that I can think about on this topic of whether how our role should progress as a statistician working on this model and whatnot. So I was at an event in Boston locally, and I was talking to a mathematics professor, and we had this conversation about when the mathematics was created, we were not dealing with that amount of data, right? So numbers were small, they were manageable, they were quantifiable. Infinity was still a very far-reaching it's still a far-reaching, but still the numbers have grown a lot since then. And and the perspective was when it was designed for those small numbers. But the moment we're talking about frequency and magnanimity of these numbers, if you look at many of the mathematical journals, they talk about, hey, the winter is coming around this, their mathematical model that is going on. And as an enterprise, we are relying more and more on sort of these statistical models that were created probably 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and heavily relying on those. So one of the as an analytics professional, I get anxious about is I don't calibrate my model that much against that. How is it responding to the error bars? Like, are there error bars that I should be worried about? And is really my mathematical model at the top of its game when I'm dealing with petabyte data nowadays compared to maybe a gigabyte or megabyte data couple of years ago, not even decades. So what's your perspective if you wear a chief analytics officer's hat? What do you suggest that how sort of anxious or how what are you thinking about this concept of how mathematical model used to sort of, when they were created, they were not playing with that much data, and right now we're dealing with data that we can't even imagine during that time when they were created.
So this is something I actually and people would say, oh well, you're biased because you learned all this back then, but I still think a lot of these algorithms are as valid as ever, because what they're doing, it is true they were originally created when there wasn't much data. But let's just take a very classic, one of the most basic examples, a classic linear regression model. The model itself is run off of a matrix, which is n by n, with n being how many variables you have, right? So the point is, I could have 200 petabytes of customer data, or I could have a gigabyte of customer data. The size of the matrix I have to actually use to get my parameters is based on how many variables I have, not how much raw data I have. And what that matrix gets you then is a set of parameters that help assess how much each of those factors actually influence the thing you're interested in influencing, what percentage of the variance is actually explained. And there's a place for that even today. I mean, the bottom line is that's what people want. I have petabytes of data. I want to know how to predict, who's going to click on this website, or I want to predict how much I need to order on my supply chain. And I think the fact that there's a lot more data doesn't in any way invalidate the algorithms. I think there's more, there's some newer methodologies that aren't as statistically based that just look for patterns. But my argument has always been, even if I'm looking for patterns, I still think that you want to. So I used to talk about sequence analytics, right? Like when it comes to say impacting an online purchase, right? Did I read an email and then I clicked and then I went to the web page and then I hit buy, or did I, see an ad and then later come in directly, then hit an email, etc. When you want to analyze those patterns across all that, those petabytes of data, the beauty is you have such a huge sample size of sessions that you probably any pattern of action that happens more than one out of several million times, you probably have a sufficient amount of data on to actually assess, is it statistically superior to other patterns, and is it one that you want to incent or disincent? And so even as you're using some non-statistical pattern recognition, I still think on the back end, what you want to do then is use some of the classical methods to determine, of the patterns I've now found that are highly frequent, are they actually different in practice in terms of their impact? And the way to measure that, there's a lot of cases it can be as easy as this. I've identified the 100 top patterns that lead to a purchase on my website. You can do just a classic means comparison. This converted X percent of the time, this converted Y, this converted Z. Are those in fact different, right? And even at that, are they different from a practical business perspective? The big flaw with some of the statistical methodologies is that the sample size goes to infinity and gets big. The differences that are, quote, statistically significant become incredibly small. And so I think the difference is that you can validate that a difference may exist, but you have to do a second layer, which is then to say, is it actually meaningful in a business context? So maybe I'm confident I get 10% extra clicks with path 1 versus path 2. If it costs me double to do the marketing required to incent path 1, but I'm only getting 10% extra clicks, then probably that may not be worthwhile. Or there's other factors. So I think there's it's a matter of being smart. It's like everything. Use the right tool for the right job. I think there's plenty of places classic stats apply. I think there's other places where some of the newer techniques can work. And I think there's a lot of cases you can combine the two and get a better result from having combined them than either would do on its own, which is the whole point of these things like an ensemble model or even these tools that try every type of model. The idea is, use them all to their strength and let the data and the business problem you're looking at dictate what actually is the best way rather than us predetermining.
Interesting. And if we talk about, say, AI, right? So if we stick to the AI piece, and as how much do you think a business should experiment on AI? Like, how much do you think AI is prime time nowadays to a point where business should consider it seriously? And do you have any benchmarks or any sort of suggestions of, hey, you should at least get AI into that much ecosystem? Like, do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah. So first of all, AI is definitely real today. One of the things, I just gave a keynote this week at a University of Cincinnati business analytics event. And, one of the first points I open with is what makes it real today. And I won't get into all the details, but right, the processing power is massively higher and cheaper. We've got all the algorithms easy to access, and we've got the data to do it. So if you look at, the big use cases everyone hears about with AI today, it's image, video, text. Well, it's only been the last few years that anyone actually even captured that data. So image recognition wasn't relevant for most businesses when they literally had no images captured and stored and ready for analysis anywhere. Obviously, that's starting to change. So I think today a lot of AI is being applied in those areas that's based on the new data. Some companies have a lot of need for that. Other companies, not so much. And I think it's a matter, like always, you start with what problems you have to solve today, and then you figure out what the right techniques are. And a lot of companies are doing the same problem that people had with big data, which was big data was a huge trend. So everyone wanted to go do something with big data. Everyone started buying big data systems and loading up big data sources, but they hadn't actually figured out what they're going to do with it. I think that's a little bit of what I see some organizations doing with AI. They're going out and buying AI platforms and doing AI projects simply because they can, and they haven't necessarily determined those are really where the top priorities for the business should be today. where they are, they should absolutely pursue it. And over time, I think it'll become integrated in. But I think this is one of these times you want to temper it and go back to the basics of identifying, what do you need to do? Why do you need to do it? And let that guide you to what you need. Back to our comment a few minutes ago, I actually asked this question at the conference, and if anybody wants to email in from our podcast, I'm trying to find anyone who's actually done research on this topic, and I may have to go do it if I can't find anyone who has, which is this. There's a lot of AI case studies where it's been proven on things like the image recognition and the natural language processing in those areas, and there's really hardly anything that could possibly mimic it in those areas. What I haven't seen is a classic case where you simply want to forecast how much to order over the next month or two, or you want to tee up the next best offer, and those actually tend to be using classical data sources. Classical in quotes. I mean, many of them we didn't have till a few years ago. The point is, your classic. It's a customer with a huge number of factors. I haven't heard a lot of AI being used in those scenarios and substantially outperforming, especially given the cost and effort to do it today, some of the classic things. Now, that could be because no one's tried. It could be because they tried, succeeded, and are keeping it quiet in stealth mode because they know it's a competitive differentiator. It could be because people have tried and they haven't been able to get AI to address some of the classical problems better than some of the methods that we've spent years developing. So I think that's the most interesting thing to me is will AI start to permeate and knock the champions out in a lot of the classic areas with decades long research and optimization in place, or will it be more applied to these areas where there frankly was no other alternative until AI came along, like the image recognition? There just weren't really any practical ways to do that, either cost wise or accuracy wise, to the extent you could afford to do it.
Interesting. I think one example that I can recall regarding sort of AI used to measure inventory systems. So I was talking to this company, a Fortune 100 company into this FMCG or CPG. And they were talking about, so the leader was talking about that he was given this task of managing inventory, understanding inventory without looking at the existing system, because it's live, it's line of business, so they cannot touch, and sort of it would take a lot of heavy lifting in selling this idea of getting new methodology. And his task was, hey, create a model through your innovative ways and run in parallel, and we will see it run for a couple of years before we can build a comfort that we can transition over to something like that. And it's a cultural mess then. Like after that, it's just and I think you were rightly point out that one of the major job of CAO is right now selling. This idea of is getting used. And then this is something which is, if it's in line of business area, it just gets really, really tricky in selling that. That's, I think, one of the data point that I can contribute that I've heard recently.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And you hit on it. It gets back to, the one analogy I use is there were countries in the world that had virtually no infrastructure, that didn't have telephones. No one was in communication, and many of them just skipped landlines and went straight to a cellular network. In some cases, their networks are actually better on average than even in the United States today, because the U.S., first of all, it still has to maintain the legacy landline infrastructure, but second of all, began with what's now legacy cell phone infrastructure, and has to go through processes of upgrades and redeployments, versus if you can go straight to the latest, newest stuff, you have a big advantage. So I think what you just hit on is a great way for existing companies to potentially really adapt to all this new stuff, which is, potentially consider, not a shadow IT, but a shadow business process where you're over time building this new thing that you're able to test. Cause it might be on a day or week delay, even because, you have to wait. You can't interrupt the actual system doing it, but once the system's done for the week, the real system, you can get that week's data and just let your new system run through it. It's just a week behind, and you can monitor what it would have done. In the worst of cases, you could do it that way. But over time, then you're able to develop the whole new system from scratch. And at some point you click it over. Again, back to the road analogy, that would be one where instead of redoing the full existing interchange where different pieces come on and off in time, every now and then they'll build a whole new bridge where they build the entire new bridge next to the other one. They set up the new lane, and there's no transition period. Literally one day at midnight, they shut the whole road down. They move the cones from the old bridge and remove them from the new bridge, and all the traffic starts flowing. And that would be the analog to what you're describing there. You're building, testing, getting it done in parallel, and have a hard switch where it's all or nothing, as opposed to a short transition where the left side of the interchange is done this year, and the next side is on the next year, and you've got the mix of old and new. I think some of the problems are going to require almost that entire let's build a parallel universe like the bridges.
Interesting point. And before we get to the last leg of the conversation, I think I also want your perspective deeply about your something like blockchain, right? So we are seeing this technology obviously bringing some trust and sort of some sort of transparency to the system, but a nightmare for compute, a nightmare for sort of computational processing. How do you evaluate something like this from your analytics executive's vantage point? Your appreciation for something like this,
right? So let's start with the premise. Let's not even worry about the merits or lack thereof of blockchain as a technology and everything that it can do. Let's simply look at it as a data source that we could analyze. Okay. So you tell me I've got this blockchain repository set up. It's got something in it that I need to analyze. Here's the challenge. And I think this was one of my blogs last fall. It's actually a bit of a nightmare today because within that blockchain repository, first of all, the entire stack has been developed not to enable analytics, but to enable trusted, secure transactions to occur and be recorded. So by definition, as opposed to a lot of the analytical platforms, they were built and optimized to do analytics. That's why they existed. When a system is built for something that has nothing to do with analytics, you can be sure that at best it's an afterthought analytics, and at worst it may not have been given any thought whatsoever. And I think with blockchain, it's much towards no thought whatsoever. So let's assume I wanted to go query a blockchain repository. Well, as of today, it's basically a recursive search. So I want to know, what are your transactional history over time? Well, I have to go in and then look recursively through all these records to find at any point in time what you did and didn't have. I don't even know how many recursive searches I have to go backwards until I've completed them. And I have to do that for every single item that you did own or may have at one point owned. And then, by the way, that processing is being distributed to computers I don't control that have a copy of the repository. Well, you're going to blow up, these aren't necessarily high-end analytical powerhouses. So these kind of analytical queries to do that recursive search, they're not meant to do that. It might be very, very inefficient. The code you have to write could be very difficult. So my view is that trying to analyze directly off a blockchain repository is going to be brutally painful. Not necessarily that it's not technically solvable to code it. I just think the hammering of the system it'll do, the slowdown of the system, and back to the operational versus the analytical. Talk about flipping the IT guys out. You try and run an analytical query against the blockchain repository, it might bring it to its knees, much like the old days. So I think we're going to have to come up with some kind of a middle ground. And my thought is, you put a set of analytic views that sit against a blockchain repository, and much like we did in a lot of days of data warehousing and so forth, where you might have had some summary tables that for performance reasons, you actually created that summary physically. I think we'll have to have some of those against the blockchain repositories where we create some of these aggregates and these summaries that run somewhat infrequently and are updated. And then we largely hit those so as to avoid having to directly query the repository. One big advantage for this over a classic architecture is that in a relational environment or any other transactional environment in history, you could go back and change things. So I might have your transaction today, but then I find that it was misentered, the wrong, I inadvertently put the wrong expiration date on your credit card, or I accidentally said that you bought a product that we then found out you didn't because you came back for a refund. We would actually change retroactively, potentially, that transaction. In blockchain, it never changes. So if we have any kind of aggregates that look at history, once they're computed once, we should never have to recompute the historical part. We would only have to update them to the extent that new history would impact them. So it would minimize the amount of reprocessing, if you will, that we might have to do. But in any case, I think from an analytics perspective, there are going to be some challenges and figure out how to actually make that work, which is totally different from saying the data in there and the processes it's enabling, do or don't have value.
Interesting, beautiful point. And again, Bill, thank you so much for giving your insight on such a critical topic. So now let's spend, we are at the last leg of a conversation. So let's spend a few minutes on your background and in your journey. So in your journey, like what are 1 to 3 point of success that you would say that has helped you stay sane throughout this evolution? Like what are some of the things that you would suggest anyone looking to get into the leadership roles on analytics, or what do you think that what would you attribute your success to?
All right, a couple of things that are probably somewhat interrelated. And so, for one thing, obviously, I think having come from a background of being hands-on, coding the models, manipulating the data, it's a big advantage as I hear people talking about what they're going to do, even if they're doing something I've never done explicitly, like predictive maintenance models. Just having a fundamental understanding of the general way this kind of stuff works and being able to visualize it in my head has been helpful. So I think to the extent that people, today that want to be a CAO do appreciate the skills they're learning as they're hands-on early in their career, I think that's important. I think another key thing, I was very lucky early on that I recognized the reality of the selling and the positioning and the politicking. And I, from an early point, I went several of my jobs in a row. I was literally the first analytically oriented person ever hired in that company to build their first analytics systems or consulting practices, et cetera. And so, from day one, I was the guy they brought in and basically said, all right, we don't know what the heck it is you do. Go figure this out for us. And, I realized early it wasn't about me going, closing a door and coming back 6 months later with some, here's what I've done. Isn't this amazing? I really spent a lot of time understanding what did they actually need? How would they actually use it? When they say they need X, do they really mean that, or do they think they mean that? And so I think that portion of the job cannot be underestimated. I would argue anyone who thinks that the selling and politicking is just a waste of time and they don't want to do it, that's fine. It's not for everyone. Then you ought to focus on the technical side of the career path, and you ought to look to be, the head architect for the CAO or the head of the deep dive AI team, because I don't think you can succeed without that. And then tied to that, but slightly different, was also something I've always believed in strongly, the recognition of that. How do you present things back and storytell and make things accessible? I can recall times in my career getting literally in yelling matches with people on my team when I was telling them to take it up a layer. We can't go in with all these p-values. We can't go in with all these parameter estimates. We got to get down to what does this person care about? And I'd have people, but Bill, if we don't give them this, we're not giving them the facts they need to make an informed decision, blah, blah, blah. But, well, you know what? These are facts that are needed for an informed decision, but our job is to make sure that those facts have been checked and that we're informed as we tell them what they need to know, which is really the result of what came out of all of these p-values and parameter estimates. The business people, even if we give it to them, they don't care. They don't understand it. They don't know how to make a decision based on that. They're not trained. It's like if I had a mechanic coming to me and instead of just saying, you've got a problem with your transmission and I did a bunch of tests, here's the list of tests I ran and I'm telling you, it tells me we need to do this, whatever it is. I'm like, great, go do it. I actually feel much worse if he comes to me, we did this test and here's what it says and this test and this test and this test. So do you agree with me based on all of this that we ought to go do this work? I mean, well, I don't know. I don't understand these tests. I don't understand these implications or how they interact. I hired you to fix my engine. You go fix it. And if I believe these tests make sense and I'm trusting your judgment, that you'll do the right thing. And we have to look at ourselves that way. And to your peers, you might want to prove your technical acumen and show that you did all the right checks and you have all the data and facts behind it. When you go to that business partner, it's much more like when you take your car and you got to think, what do they really need to know to understand the decision they should make, what benefit they'll have, and have trust that you're basing that recommendation on all this other stuff that they frankly don't want to deal with. And I think it's our job to not make them deal with it, whereas a lot of people think it's their job to deal with it. And I think that's a fundamental distinction that holds people back. You see people all the time, really smart, have done really good analytics, and he's actually like, you know what, can I have Bob come instead of Sue? Because Sue I can never understand where she's going, or she overwhelms me. I really like Bob's style. And often it's not that Bob is a better analytics person than Sue necessarily. It's that Bob has managed to speak the language of that person. And to me, I think that could be, I finish with that because that might be the most important thing. Because even as you're doing the politicking, forget about describing the results. It's all about the language that you use and the level at which you talk about it to convince people to do things with you that they do not understand and are not comfortable with, and that could cost them their job if they're wrong. That really takes a lot of work, effort, and trust. And you can't do that if you're trying to build the trust by showing that you're super smart in this area and can rattle off 200 metrics that, supposedly tell a story.
Interesting. Great point, Bill. And if we also sort of ask our guest to share some of the books that they have read with our viewers and listeners. So do you have some books that you like that you could share with our listeners and viewers?
What's interesting? It sounds wrong. I just don't have much. I don't have time to read as many books as I used to anymore. And as a guy who's written a couple books, I'm my own worst enemy to say that, right? But what I found I actually tend to like to do anymore is I actually like to go out. I've got a feed set up where sites that have good blogs that I like, I tag them and I look, for articles every week. And I tend now I prefer to try and find, every week 10 to 20 blog posts or articles that are relevant on different interrelated topics to get a feel for what's going on. Then to get a deep dive in. Now that could be, again, a little biased because my role is to really keep an eye on everything. To the extent that I had very specific problems to solve, if I was tasked with setting up a new, digital marketing and analytics system, I think I probably would then go buy look for some good books on that topic. But I think today, kind of like how algorithms are ubiquitous, a lot of information now, I'd say if you find a person that you really like their writing, so for example, if you really like my blogs, you might very well like my books. It'd be a good bet. But, you can test out both a website in terms of its focus and the individual writers on that site, pretty easily these days. And that's actually my preferred method. I've got probably 20 or 30 sites I've tagged. And every time someone sends me a link from a new one that I like, I'll add it for a while and see if their feed pops up articles that are relevant enough to keep it in the mix for me.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Bill, on that. And so this is the last but not the least question for the session. So if
and real quick, you know what I just realized? Make sure you send me yours. What I'm thinking about it, I'm trying to think if I have your site actually linked as a feed, like where this podcast will be posted. Make sure I have that because I'd love to check out some of these podcasts. And I know I've come across one or two, but now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure I don't have this actually as part of my feed that I'll get an update.
Okay. I'll make sure that. And thank you so much on that, Bill. So before we part ways, I want, if one thing listeners and viewers can take away from this conversation, what do you think would that one thing be that you want viewers and listeners to take away?
I think if you wrap all of this together, it's to realize that we have to step back as analytical professionals, whether, again, data scientists, whether you're doing the clinical trial work, whatever the case is. And we often talk to people about all the disruption that's happening in business. And then we look at ourselves as part of that disruption, and rightfully so. I think a lot of our conversation today involved how we're being disrupted and our own job role and our own focuses are being disrupted. And I think the main takeaway for me would be that anyone who thinks that 5-10 years from now, you can have success and high compensation doing exactly what you're doing today as an analytics professional or data scientist is going to be, sadly mistaken. Things are changing way too fast. Your point between AI coming to be a much bigger role, between the way the cloud is accelerating certain trends to the way that new data sources and problems are being solved. All of this, that we've talked about the analytical tools that automate a lot of what we've spent a lot of time doing historically. All of this points to the need for us to examine our own roles and how we're being disrupted before we get disrupted, and how we can ride that instead of fall victim. And much like in business, there are businesses and there are people within business who see the disruption and adjust and succeed, and those who go down under it. I think in the analytics world, we're already seeing. You can already see people who are struggling to have an impact today because they haven't adjusted and picked up new skills and new perspectives with all this. And, I think that one of the most important ones, especially for young people who pride themselves on their programming acumen today, I think that will be less and less of an impact moving forward. I think the knowledge of what needs done is still going to have a lot of merit. Back to my analogy of you'll be the conductor, the orchestrator, you'll be that business liaison, but it'll be that skill to think that in that bigger picture that's going to be the big differentiator. And that's always been part of the value prop, but I think it's going to be the substantial value prop within a few years outside of some of the niche people where you're developing the new AI algorithm that's never been done before. That's going to be hardcore coding, but that's a small percentage. And in a business environment, that just never happens. That's more of a research university, or a research lab, niche within a big company. But on the business side, I think you can take it to the bank that you better be thinking about what unique skills you have that will remain unique and valuable over the next 5 to 10 years. And today, start focusing on redefining your annual objectives and your training goals and your reading on the weekends to reinforce those skills rather than focusing on whatever's made you get to where you are today.
I think that's a fabulous close, Bill. I think thank you so much again for being extremely generous with your time and walking us through some of the insights that we should learn as a community to understand what's going on in the world of analytics and the future of data. Thank you so much. You're always welcome back on the podcast to share your journey. Wish you nothing but success in your role in IA and beyond. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for having me.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a